29.
28 seconds.
27.
26.
25 seconds.
24. 23.
22 seconds.
21 seconds.
20 seconds.
19.
18.
17 seconds.
16.
15 seconds.
14.
13 seconds.
12.
11.
10 seconds. 9.
8.
7.
6.
6 points.
Copy.
5 seconds.
3, 2, 1.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Subspace Chatter, the show where we boldly go into discussing a Star Trek original series. Today, we'll be discussing the classic episode, Balance of Terror. If everybody is ready, we can do introductions. I'm Vanessa, and I host a YouTube channel called I Love Bad Star Trek. Dan?
I have a bit of Balance of Terror for doing a self-introduction, but I'll do it nonetheless. Hi, I'm Dan Lackey, one-time admin of Memory Alpha, and editor-in-chief at WarpFactorTrek.com.
Hi, I'm Brad, and the Bird of Prey I wrote it on.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Glenn Iverson, and I've been listening to Star Trek since before I was born, since I was actually produced right during the middle of the first season.
Oh.
66.
So when during the episode, we finally get to see the Romulans, as is explained in the episode, that the Romulans hadn't been seen since the end of the war. Well, they hadn't been seen at all. And we finally do see them on the view screen, and they look very similar to Spock. And during that sequence, were you waiting for Spock to say, "Dad, what are you doing on a Romulan ship?"
I actually do expect to see an alternate universe version where we actually do see this at some point. Somebody's going to do it, either in production or as a fan film. And if nobody else does it, I'll take care of it.
It's not like it hasn't been done for Strange New Worlds.
Right. Multiverse stuff.
Well, the actor that played the commander, the Romulan
Mark
commander, was brought back to play Spock's father, right?
Yeah,
Right.
but only
So we hadn't seen that relationship, so I think it was probably confusing for the audience initially when the actor was brought back to play Sarek.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Mark Lambert. I also found that, like, when I was actually researched, like how Spock talks about his parents in the first season and stuff like that, there's quite a few references to them in the past. And I was like, that might be confusing.
Mhm.
I could definitely see that being an easy retcon, since the Romulans are supposed to be offshoots of the Vulcans. Therefore, there's bound to be some people that look like members of the other species.
Right.
In fact,
There
I
was
think
some
there's-
kind of fracture there. And
I think there's even like a novel or two where like they're brothers or something like that.
Mhm.
Where they, I'm maybe misremembering that.
Well, it did a really good job of setting up a concern or kind of a topical, I guess, point of that era, and it still lingers on today, right? Which is the subtle racism of kind of cultural associations. So if you're Belarusian, right, and your Russian allies or friends or neighbors are invading neighboring community, like they are today, are the Belarusians by their association, are they experiencing any blowback against against them because of their political associations, right? And the answer to that is most likely there are some people willing to use their extend their bigotry to others just because they want to be bigoted, they want to be a problem for people. And I think back in the 60s and 70s that was a more common phenomenon, but it was a much more visual, right? issue. So the racism that they were dealing with in the civil rights era was kind of a topic of what this episode was as well. And I really liked how it was handled in the original series episode. I think it was just point blank, straightforward. This is it. No discussion necessary. Done.
I think it's been interesting recently where some people have raised the point that, like, the sort of the bigoted perspective that we see of Styles in Balance of Terror surely is not like his character, the extent of who his personality and persona is, because he would have never graduated from Starfleet Academy if that was the case. If he was like so bigoted and stuff like that. And I think it's probably a recent, he sees the Romulans on the view screen. I think it's probably a recent other thing, a recent, that triggers him in that way. But then again, he does talk about like him having had ancestors to do with the Romulan War in the past, like on the future.
Right.
And someone, I think it was Vanessa, who asked who is the commander, what is the commander's name, but the commander doesn't have a name in this episode, nor the Romulan commander in the Enterprise Instant. They're both nameless, but the actor is Mark Leonard.
Well, the gentleman who has the pylon fall onto him, I think his name was Centurion, or they call him Centurion.
Right. Yeah.
I thought like this was, and sort of like piggybacking off of what Brad was talking about with regard to the racism. I think like the sort of visual cues to sort of look at somebody similar to someone that you're in opposition to and assuming that they're in league with one another. It also calls back to like the Japanese internment camps where people were sort of rounded up for absolutely no reason other than being Japanese or resembling the people that they were fighting, and being sort of abducted from their homes and put in camps. And there was absolutely no reports of that being a reasonable measure. And I believe that George Takei was somebody who was put in that position.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, it works on a lot of levels. I think like the Romulans definitely also call back to the North Koreans for being isolationists and sort of like hiding behind that border. There's just, and the proxy wars that were fought, and the sort of American perspective of those wars that, the Romulans are aggressing, where a proxy war is, basically a way for a superpower to test the resolve of another superpower by sort of triangulating another country and their conflict and that whole thing. So and Americans just sort of took it upon themselves to make it their business because, we got to keep doing war stuff because that stuff's got to keep in business. So it was really interesting to sort of watch the sort of many threads of subtext there.
Well, I enjoyed the writing because of that, right? Mm-hmm. They were telling a story that was topical for the era. They were dealing with issues that were topical of the times, that were not just geopolitical, but also social in nature. That they weren't beating a drum about it either. It wasn't like they were pounding on it the entire episode. They had it logically occur for the characters that were presented in the episode. So it made sense, and how it was dealt with made sense. Of course, it was the 60s, so in the 70s, so you had to have a lot of stories wrap up neatly in a bow. There weren't a lot of two-parters or series-long arcs. It was what it was in terms of the entertainment of the time. But it was kind of groundbreaking in that they were dealing with issues that might not have been popular to deal with at the time.
Right. Like it definitely, goes into using alien analogy and the sort of sci-fi veneer to get away with making comments about very relevant and present things at the time. But I think that alien analogy was pretty, it wasn't so obscure that you didn't know what they were trying to say. I think that's a very Star Trek thing to do. And I think that's why this is classic Star Trek, because the social issue is very obvious. Like the things that they're saying are very obvious, but it's Star Trek. So they put Romulans instead of XYZ. How does this compare or contrast with Quality of Mercy, the season finale of Strange New Worlds? Personally, I think with Balance of Terror, the lack of special effects actually work in its favor. A lot of the action, a lot of the most tense moments are just the crew reacting to news of what is happening. They're just hearing about stations being blown up. They're just hearing about people dying, and in extremely heavily fortified places, like in the middle of asteroids, and covered with the hardest substance known to science. I thought that was a little silly, but I think whereas with Quality of Mercy, there was a lot more seeing things going on and sort of panning out in the wide. Whereas in Balance of Terror, you're really tight close-ups on people's reactions to what's going on.
And even stuff like you see the Praetor in Quality of Mercy, and you don't in Balance of Terror. But regarding characters and stuff like that, I always think Balance of Terror is quite interesting because one of the Romulans is played by Lawrence Montagna, who I read his autobiography, and he played Stawn later in Amok Time, and was actually considered to be introduced as a new Vulcan that would have replaced Spock, because Leonard Nimoy wanted out of his contracts during the original series.
Well, T'Pring would have been pissed. I think part of the reason why, they had to rely on the techniques of the time, right? CGI was just in its infancy, right? So they used a lot of models and puppetry in those early seasons, right? And they're using the best technology they had at their disposal. So that was also quite expensive and time consuming to do. So I think they needed to find ways of being dramatic and using the angles and the powerful music to emphasize that's an important moment or an important experience or an important kind of bit. Then they're communicating to the audience without actually having to show it. Whereas today, CGI is fairly, it's expensive, but it's more commonplace and it's easier and quicker to.
It wasn't known then at all. It was only introduced in Star Trek II to Wrath of Khan, basically. There wasn't such a thing as CGI back then.
Well, what I'm saying is that now, because we rely on things like CGI, we can tell the story in a much more expansive way that maybe they didn't have the opportunity to do, or the technical expertise, even with models, to create something believable and visually entertaining, right, for the audience.
Yeah, I agree, but also I think that method has potential, especially for today's audiences to perhaps come across as really quite slow. There was recently, I can't remember who it was, but someone was saying that they rewatched the Corbomite maneuver and found that so languorous, because you've got so many shots of the just reaction shots on the bridge and stuff like that, and a similar sort of situation there, I thought, because what else are they going to cut to? They don't have CGI, in those days, and sort of similar situation.
It was also a matter of pacing. Back in the 60s, pretty much all shows were the way Star Trek is in terms of pacing, where stories took time to develop. You took time to get to know the situation, get to know the people. And these days, especially a lot of younger audiences want the action, they want the visuals, they want to be stimulated. And if they aren't stimulated, then they lose attention. So in a way, the different shows reflect the times. Strange New Worlds, the episode, immerses the audience in an audiovisual spectacle, and we actually, in a way, kind of feel like we're part of the moment. In Balance of Terror, it relies heavily on the suspense, and those of us who are a little bit older and have a little bit more patience are just glued to the TV while we're waiting for the suspense to build, waiting for the situation to resolve, and paying attention to all the little details.
Right.
Yeah, I saw also, like, it was a shot by shot comparison I watched between A Quality of Mercy and the sort of copied scenes that were originally from Balance of Terror, and I was like really surprised by how, like, each shot that has dialogue in it, A Quality of Mercy was very much, sped up pacing, even for the dialogue. That was a surprise to me.
Well, they had more to tell. They had not just the original kind of moments that they had to include, but they had to have a lot more stuff in the background. So they had to tell the same story with more in the same basic amount of time.
It was really striking to me watching Balance of Terror again how much of the episode is exposition, how much of it is other people relaying to each other like what the situation is, and even looking at the map. It's just very submarine warfare, where everybody's very extremely closed off from one another and trying to strategize against an enemy blind.
Well, and not to mention the fact that they were world building. This was before. I mean, no one knew very much about this universe that they were creating for this particular story, for this particular series. Now we know so much that we're bickering online about little minutia, little tiny details that are like, I believe it's stem bolts. No, it's stem bolts. I mean, people are just dealing with these pronunciations, so it's just different time.
Yeah, and the new Quality of Mercy, we're revisiting that episode from like a completely different perspective and a completely different reason.
Right.
So I think both are successful in different ways, but I do really give credit for Balance of Terror working with the limited resources that they have and building the suspense as effectively as they did.
Yeah, I think like there's not only like what we've all talked about, which is our perspective of how the two episodes are different, but even in universe they're also different, because like this is supposed to be the prime timeline, and the Quality of Mercy is showing us like an alternate timeline.
Well, I enjoyed the original series, the theatrical lighting that they used, the colorful kind of mood lighting that they created to help create the background or tapestry, the depth, something going on behind, right? It wasn't so monochromatic. And I definitely enjoyed the use of sound cues. So the way they tied in music and sound, all that signaled in a very theatrical way, which was appealing to the original, for me, which was an appealing aspect of the original series, because it was very clear what you were meant to feel, and how you were supposed to be emotionally following through with the story. So those were good things.
And like having to run silent for 9 hours, and Sulu and Styles are just at the controls, just sweating and like just their eyes glued to the view screen. It just really is so tense. And one beat I didn't remember was that Uhura at one point takes over for navigation.
Yeah.
because Styles has to go to engineering. I really appreciated that. I don't know. She doesn't, I don't believe she has any lines at navigation, but I appreciated that she got at least a temporary promotion.
But wasn't that one of the moments that was it's often, you know, referred back to as a key aspect of the cultural kind of social commentary, given a woman and giving a person of color, right, an African American woman of the time, a role like that was just to even having her show competency to be able to plop in. That was striking at the time.
So it was effective for the time. I thought it was sort of something that Strange New Worlds is also lost a perspective on, and sort of increased my appreciation for that moment, because with Strange New Worlds, having seen like Uhura going through the rotations in different posts, and then seeing like she is able to handle other stations other than communications, which she does in Balance of Terror.
Like, how does everybody feel about the contrast between specifically like Styles' character and Ortega's? Because Styles has a very personal connection with the Romulans because of the ancestors, and then Kirk quickly shuts it down and says, "Hey, that was that's history. That's not you."
There's no place for that on the bridge, mister.
Right, exactly. And also in the, as forgettable as it was, the season 1 finale of TNG, Worf also offers the information about his parents being killed by the Romulans, and then Picard quickly shuts that down. So how, like, Ortega's doesn't seem to have a personal connection with the Romulans in the same way. So it's sort of like, why is she so suspicious? Is she just a Styles stand-in? Is she just parroting what Styles said just to have that, beat in there, to have that tension? That's one thing I think in terms of like messaging that I don't think Quality of Mercy got quite right, is because Kirk, very quickly tamps that bigotry down and, to get everybody focused again on the task at hand. Whereas Pike just sort of shouts over Ortega's and doesn't really, it doesn't have the same impact.
I think they're both navigators, but I wonder if it may have been more effective if instead of Ortega's, it may have been Mitchell.
Well, I did not. One of the things I liked about the original series was that tamping down very quickly, very firmly. Right? You keep your attitudes about that to yourself. Lock them in your quarters. They don't make it out. Right. It was a free speech comment, but it was, you have the attitudes you have, but right now in this situation, on the bridge, on my crew, this bigotry doesn't have a place here, right? So it was like, what you do in your own home, that's up to you, but when you come out, be professional. And that's what I liked about the original series. Mm-hmm. I really disliked that moment in Quality of Mercy because it seemed like the woman, or the person wasn't being treated in a way that had them as kind of equals, right? It wasn't a professional kind of relationship. It was both people reacting from a position of emotion. And I thought that was a significant departure from the original storyline. But it also struck me as very unusual for Pike. Pike is not a shouter. He's not a yeller. But in that moment, he did. And he yelled over someone who had an attitude that he wasn't saying no to. He wasn't saying that was not appropriate. He wasn't saying any of that. He was letting them rant, but not acknowledging the core concept, which is maybe they're a little bit bigoted, maybe they're a little bit, they're holding on to something here, and we need to move past it. But that's my attitude.
Right.
I didn't like it so much.
Like questioning the integrity of a superior officer is insubordination in general. And then on top of that, accusing them of being a spy just because they look similar, that this is a disciplinary action. It's not just like a civil rights statement. It's a, getting back in line. And
referring to the pointy-eared elephant in the room, that comment about the physical appearance of a colleague is a bigoted, racist comment. It would be defined or attributed to that quality, right? So I just thought it was wrong not to deal with it as such.
I think there's perhaps more logic in the outworking of it and the execution of it in Balance of Terror, because the Romulans look more like Vulcans, but in the Cause of Mercy with the head bumps, they look more. They don't look so much like the Vulcans.
Right. Maybe that's how they got around it. But Spock himself does say that they are, and there was an association, right, in story. So, that was one of the things that was off about it in my estimation.
I agree.
Any thoughts about that?
Oh, I agree with what everybody said. There was a reason for Styles to be the way he was because of his history with the Romulans. There was no actual reason for Ortega's to be that way. But by the same token, they had Styles reacting the same way throughout the series throughout the episode until Spock saves him. Whereas in Strange New Worlds, once she gets her comments out and Pike yells at her, it's done. She doesn't act that way throughout the rest of the episode. So at least in that respect, they did a good job of tamping that down. But I do understand why they were trying to call back to the original episode, since they were doing that throughout the entire episode.
I also thought it was a little bit similar to having seen Strange New Worlds is so new, I can't remember the name of all the episodes. But I thought it was a little bit similar to how Ortegas is portrayed in the sort of childhood, the story, nursery story or whatever one. Which obviously it's seeing
Elysian Kingdom.
Yeah, thanks. It's seeing Ortegas in a different light.
But don't you think it does a disservice to Ortegas?
Yeah,
because we don't know much about her as a character. We only know a little bit, and now we're seeing her in with this kind of attitude that is possibly, it's off-putting, is what it is.
I thought there was more that's been said about Ortegas behind the scenes, such as in an article I forwarded to Vanessa, regarding like her, how Melissa Navia, the actress who played her, was talking about Ortega's sexuality. I thought there was more sort of character building and stuff like that in that interview and what Melissa has said about her character than there has been in the entire series so far. Which is sad in and of itself, right? That we know so little, and the stuff that we're being shown is, it's quite sad.
And this is why the hashtag #MoreTegas is all over the internet, because we want to see more about her character. But even though we have only seen a little bit of Ortegas in each episode, there's still more character building, even with her, than there is in most of the Discovery cast throughout the first 4 seasons.
It's interesting how attached we are to these characters, even though the series is brand new and there's only 10 episodes of them, that like already people are so upset about Hemmer dying and Ortegas not getting the backstory she deserves. Like I think it's a testament to how good the show is. What do you think of this episode as a tribute to the enemy below or submarine warfare in general?
Well, they knew then, right? Oh, I mean, in terms of military, and because Starfleet was modeled on some of those military tactics and the idea of three-dimensional chess and all of that. But they could only envision warfare in space, like warfare below the waves or on the waves of the ocean. So they were quite limited with what they could at the time kind of describe, or how they could portray this conflict. And I thought they did fine. I mean, what did I know when I was first seeing it? What did anybody know about space battles when the episode first aired, right? So they just accepted it for what it was. Now, of course, we look back and say, phasers, those aren't phasers. Those are torpedoes. What are they doing? But that's what we think of now.
Yeah, I thought it was a wonderful tribute. I thought the tactical decisions made by each side were brilliantly executed, and were what we would see in space. Of course, we have to use poetic license with being able to spot somebody through sound, since sound doesn't travel through the vacuum of space. But it's possible in the 23rd century they developed ways of detecting sound without the waves reaching the ship. But yeah, I appreciate the decisions made by each in reaction to the other.
Mm.
And I also thought it was brilliant that the idea that the cloak would stop the Romulans from being able to see the Enterprise crew, just as the Enterprise couldn't see the cloak ship.
I just think Star Trek is most successful when they do their battles in general as a submarine warfare type thing, where strategy and not just guns blazing is what is it's all about, like thinking ahead of the enemy and trying to out strategize them. I really appreciate that. I liked, the guy in engineering hitting the button for the torpedo tubes was really cool. Like even the sound of it sounded very much like a submarine, the sonar, the sort of running quiet 9 hours of not making a single sound is just the amount of tension that they place on these people to, remain so focused for so long on, one thing. And that is either, getting and trying to get them before they get you. The cat and mouse thing about this is extremely submarine. And I absolutely love that. How does Pike in Equality of Mercy's approach differ from that of Kirk's, and what would you have done in this position?
Oh, here we go.
Well, I thought Kirk's approach in Balance of Terror was kind of halfway between that of the Pike and Kirk in Strange New Worlds, showing more patience than his alternate timeline counterpart, but more experience and more aggressiveness than Pike. I mean, I know that Strange New Worlds was trying to show how Kirk would have been with less experience as a starship captain and no time to develop his skills and relations with Spock, but I really think that the casting and directing of Paul Wesley in this instance fell flat. As far as Kirk versus Pike, Pike was a product of his upbringing in his time. He's not quite as aggressive as Kirk. He overthought this one. And I believe that, because he's learned his lesson, he's not going to do so much overthinking again. He's going to get a little bit more of an aggressive streak, but still, without being reckless like Strange New Worlds version of Kirk.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think I would agree with Glenn that there were character flaws in both Pike and Kirk in Quality of Mercy that were caused by the lives they led up to that point. Right? Kirk didn't have Spock. He wasn't part of the Enterprise crew. He didn't have the seasoning that he needed in that role to be able to approach it the way classic Kirk did in the TOS episode that made him ultimately successful. So the approach Kirk took in Quality of Mercy was a flawed approach and too hot-headed and too aggressive, while Pike's more calm, measured, discussion-based model or discussion-based approach fell flat as well, because it didn't rise to the level of tension or conflict that moment demanded him to react with a level of animosity. So I don't know which way I would have. I don't know. I think I would have been, given myself, I probably would have been more like Ortega's in this time, right? Been a little bit angry about stuff, and if I'd seen somebody, watching someone that I just had a conversation with or that I had a relationship with, a friend, someone I knew who had just been, right in front of me on the view screen, I would have been pissed. And I might have been a lot more aggressive than either Kirk in either series.
I really think that Kirk took as measured of an approach for as long as he could stand in Balance of Terror. He didn't want to just go in guns a-blazing, but at the same time, there were star bases being destroyed.
Right.
And it's like, how many more people are going to die before we defend ourselves?
Right.
These people are provoking us, and no, we don't want a full-scale war, but we also don't want to just keep allowing people to just die and be expendable in the interests of avoiding war. And he made clear from the very beginning that the Enterprise itself was expendable in trying to maintain that. So
I often think that's one aspect where Balance of Terror is a bit similar to Arena, where there's attacks going on to begin with, but then like Kirk and crew are called upon to respond to. I also find it interesting that in Balance of Terror, there's the couple that are to be married, Angela Martine and Robert Tomlinson. And in Balance of Terror, it's Robert Tomlinson who dies, and in A Quality of Mercy, it's the woman Angela Martine. I thought that was an interesting flip, and wondered, is that a result of the butterfly effect that's been spoken about before, or is that a result of some command decision?
So instead of the man and the couple dying, it's the woman, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I think I definitely personally would have handled things much like Kirk.
Which Kirk?
Oh, sorry. The one in Balance of Terror. the Kirk in Quality of Mercy is going off half-cocked and does not really think through every possibility in quite the same way Pike does. But I also believe that Pike himself was very naive in thinking that, in spite of the fact that these people have no qualms with killing people who have done absolutely nothing except exist, that these people are ready for a reasonable conversation. I thought that was really naive and not thinking. That I just thought that was a very goofy response to someone who is presenting a very immediate and existential threat. I think Kirk was, level-headed. I think he was, he had his wits about him most of the time. I do believe, he did at one point say, I don't want to do this. I want to be on a boat. I want to be somewhere else right now. I don't want to have this responsibility in Balance of Terror. I'd rather be doing literally anything else than this. But he did, pull himself together and remain professional and get the job done. I really think he handled it very well.
I found an interview I read with one of the showrunners from Strange New Worlds, Henry Alonzo Myers, quite interesting. He was talking about the Kirk in A Quality of Mercy, and he was saying so much of that depiction is based so much on the Kirk in Balance of Terror. And nothing, in isolation, basically, nothing, no other portrayals of Kirk. So I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting because throughout the entire episode of Balance of Terror, Kirk never really raises his voice. He never like tries to pick a fight with anybody. He's not argumentative. He's very decisive and very clear about what his goal is. So I find that interesting that they would say that it was, yeah, I don't see that.
Does anyone feel like so first, right? There was the point I wanted to make was that there's geopolitical concerns in TOS and in Quality of Mercy, right? They say very clearly, even though I might want to, well, they don't say it maybe clearly, but they infer it. Even though I might want to have a reaction that is one way, I don't want to plunge because my personal reaction, plunge the rest of, commit everyone to a conflict that could kill millions or billions of people. But I found that the Kirk in Quality of Mercy was more closely aligned to the Kirk that was depicted in the Kelvin timeline by Chris Pine. Even he even looks similar, right? Those two physically look similar, and the reaction that I get that we get from Kirk in Quality of Mercy is similar to that of Chris Pine in the initial, the initial movie.
Although other people have drawn the comparison between that Kirk and Jim Carrey's one.
Okay, if we're going to start talking about absurdities,
let's not go off on a tangent and just concentrate on Balance of Terror.
Jim Carrey
I do have to say that
an impression of Captain Kirk at one point. I just wanted to throw that out there. Sorry. Go ahead, Glenn.
Oh, I was going to say, I was definitely reminded of Jim Carrey in terms of physical appearance, and I'm wondering if the casting director was influenced by that because, even though physical appearance isn't the most important part of the character, I do believe that the casting of Paul Wesley interfered with many people's enjoying the show. And, at the same time, I realize that they're trying to show a less mature, less experienced version of Kirk in terms of battle in Strange New Worlds, but I thought the direction of him fell flat. I thought he was very one-dimensional. And you would think that, at least a little bit of Kirk's swagger or a little bit of Kirk's thoughtfulness, a little bit of Kirk's military strategy would come through, from the original series. That he didn't have to ask Shatner-esque. Nobody wants that. But I do think that they fell flat on making Paul Wesley's Kirk too one-dimensional. I think that was... I would say that's probably more the fault of the director than the actor because I've seen him act in other shows and he's been brilliant. So that's just my one thing that I wanted to put in there.
I think it's interesting how much Balance of Terror seems to have inspired Strange New Worlds with not only like a Quality of Mercy, but also like the director of episode 4, Strange New Worlds, Momentum Mori, having like cited Balance of Terror, I believe, as inspirational in that episode. And when I was watching Balance of Terror recently, seeing like how like you see Kirk and like in the command chair and he's like backlit by red and stuff like that, and it occurred to me like when you see like those sort of shots, it really like reminded me of like pre-release promotional images of the Strange New Worlds cast where they're similarly like backlit by red. How was it?
No, I think you're right. The use of theatrical lighting to create mood or to elicit emotion or some type of reaction is really key. And they did that when they lit the backs, the back of all the framing in Quality of Mercy. They darkened and they lit the eyes and they had colors, flashing. Even in this moment where Spock was looking in that little view screen, right? There was this beautiful blue and angled imagery flashing on his face. They used color, I thought, in this episode more than they'd had previously. Just like in the episode with the Gorn, they used a much to a much greater extent a monochromatic kind of color palette, just like the original Aliens movies, which kind of was that episode was reminiscent of the Aliens style movie. To me, the whole color palette of that episode was similar. much more stark and much more dark.
Yeah,
But-
and I believe that the fact that the Strange New Worlds cinematography and video team wanted to emulate the original series is testament to how wonderfully the original series was done, because the lighting, the angles, everything really reflected the moods that they were trying to convey, and just really put us into the story.
I really like. I've always really liked the color palette of Balance of Terror, especially like on board the Romulan bird of prey. And I sort of missed that with like it being replaced by such a dark sort of environment in also Mercy. I really like there's so much purple and stuff like that, and I think it does look like the instruments that they're looking through in Balance of Terror. I think sort of does remind me as well of Submarine warfare, of the tripod screen or whatever.
Right, looking like the scopes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think maybe like so much purple and so like they're famous for having done in sickbay like lighting an entire wall with like one stretch of light may have been viewed as, I don't know, campy or whatever in the case of the Romulans, but it's something that I've always like really liked, really appreciated.
I like this sort of really happy beginning that we get with the wedding. Even Scotty's got a big cheese-eating grin on his face, like, hey, everybody's really excited, and not even at the start of the wedding ceremony, like just before everything gets together, like Kirk is alerted. So it's sort of like you get this sort of hazy, gauzy, happy, peaceful, loving interaction at the very beginning, and that is just smacked away like a golf ball on a tee, and it kicks off the tension of the episode.
Regarding that scene, I wondered what people might make of because that's like one of the very few instances of religion being shown in the original series, and I think in Quality of Mercy it's basically replaced by a cargo bay, but in like Balance of Terror it is like literally a chapel, and there are like various there's a cross and various symbols of different Earth religions. I wondered what people if people might think that was too over the head, or
Yeah, I thought it was very well done. It represented the fact that there are many religions on Earth, and it's even though it's called a chapel, which it's called a chapel, not a church, so it's reflective of being multi-denominational. So I thought they did it very well. Changing it to a cargo bay in Strange New Worlds, maybe they just wanted to take religion out of the experience entirely. I do remember reading somewhere that Gene Roddenberry was an atheist, so but I think he liked to be representative of all people.
Although he did say as well that he believed in God. It's different from what people understand.
Yeah, he also had like a Shinto ceremony for his wedding. He actually like flew to Japan with Majel, and I didn't really feel that the religious aspect of the wedding ceremony was any sort of. I didn't feel like it was propaganda for Christianity or anything like that. It was just sort of like a wedding ceremony where two people just loved each other on the ship and they just wanted to get married, and it just happens to be in a chapel. And that's where Kirk officiates these things. And it would be nice, if we're having, especially at this era of the timeline, a majority of humans from Earth to have a place where if you do have spirituality or just want to have a space where you just want to pray in peace or just have a quiet moment, to have that on the ship, I think that would be a nice feature.
Yeah, I thought of course, I'm just looking at TOS, and I found that the inclusion of a spirituality component of kind of life was inclusive of all kind of segments of society. Some people don't have any sense of spiritual self. Some people have a very specific sense of spiritual self. They align with a certain religious faith that then provides them with guiding principles. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The nod to that in the original series is, I thought, a very nice kind of connection to the whole person, the whole being, and it wasn't exclusionary, which I thought the shift to a cargo bay, it becomes more like a civic union. It's more of a legal thing. It's less about honoring and faith and trust and love and care. It's just kind of like a bond. It's kind of like, stem bolts, piecing two people together in a kind of structured union. And I don't know, there's something is taken away from it, I think, for me. But I appreciated TOS's approach, and I definitely appreciated at the end when they didn't make Faith after the loss and the consoling, which I thought was a bit kind of like a patronizing, male captain hugging the female crew member, and even though she came for the hug, and he, and it became very fatherly, paternal, which I thought was fine at the time, because that's what the attitude was about, society in general. There was, more of an appreciation of the older, wise person guiding the younger, inexperienced person, however it played out. But I just liked the ending of the TOS episode for how they wrapped it from an emotional perspective, because it wasn't so much her hurt and pain. It was the burden that Kirk carried now because of the decision he made, which cost the life of her husband or fiance, and how he had to wrestle with that in that 5 seconds that they gave him to wrestle with the pain of the moment, and then exit to go about the rest of his responsibilities and his own personal journey. I thought they did a great job of showing him transition from regret and pain to captain, right? Reacting on a personal level to becoming the figurehead of the crew. That ending was really spot on, I thought. And they didn't give Pike the same. They didn't give Pike the same at the end. They gave him a different kind of quality, a different kind of ending, because it was more of a personal journey in that story for Quality of Mercy. I
thought that they were sort of comforting each other at the end. That, he had to deal with the stress of possibly instigating a war between two superpowers, and thank God that didn't happen. But I had a question about, the woman's reaction to her fiance's death. How did everybody see that? Because she seemed pretty chill about it to me. I understand it's a occupational hazard of being on a starship, that you could possibly lose people that you're close to or lose anybody. But she seemed just very placid.
Don't you think though that was there were two choices, right? She could have broken down and blubbered, and that could have changed the entire tenor of her as a character, as a professional on the crew, right? She would have been deemed the emotional woman, right? Which is honestly from a kind of a feminist perspective, it might not have been very, very well received. But she, dealt with her pain and tried to work through it and left. And I could see why you would say that it was she kind of was okay with it. But I wonder if it was because they were trying to show a female character as a stronger character in that moment.
Yeah, equating strength and lack of emotion, though.
Yeah, okay.
Having to, button up everything to put other people at ease professionally. It reminds you that a man's running it. So it exhibiting emotion being on par with a lack of strength. But yeah,
that was the approach of the time.
Yeah.
Right. regardless of how we would view it today, at the time, if you were going through emotional difficulties, whether you were a man or a woman, and it was in an outward facing kind of profession or out in a job, you were expected to button it up and carry on, soldier on, so to speak. So it's possible that was a reflection of the attitudes of the time.
I believe it could also be because, this has just recently happened and people mourn in different ways. Some people just break down and cry. Some people go into shock. It looked to me in that scene like she'd just gone through a period of mourning and she was kind of back into the shock of it. I know that me personally, when I lost my girlfriend last year, it was kind of a similar thing that I would go back and forth between emotion and just being in total shock and just, burying myself in my work sort of thing. So I actually considered it to be a fairly realistic interpretation of what could have happened.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Sorry for your loss.
Yeah. Sorry for your loss as well. But I agree with you, like different people deal with loss and mourning and stuff in different ways. I also found it interesting on Facebook when people were commenting. It's something like, I guess, by in production order, because production orders for the original series is different from the order that we aired in originally. But if you view it in production order, it's something like 2 episodes later or something like that, and the same character is with like having another relationship with another male crew member, and they're like, isn't that a bit soon? Yeah, with the loss, but
we don't know how much time had elapsed between those 2 episodes, though. Like, it could be a long time. And
even going by star dates, well, the whole idea on star dates is accounting for the theory of.
I tend to think of it in terms of a storytelling perspective. From a storytelling perspective, it's intentionally there to communicate something of import. So it's not just the character's personal journey and how it's about something more than that. So that's why I say I think they may have done that to show strength in a character that would have otherwise been perceived as expected to be breaking down into tears because they can't control their emotions. That would have been the attitude of the time.
But so, I think there are some instances of that. Like I was thinking about A Land of Troyes, for example. There's some like examples of females who can't control their emotions or seemingly can't in the original series. So I think they did go there in some situations.
Well, in the very next episode, right, in the original series, has them on that planet with the civilization that reads their minds and replicates kind of people, and from their past they could relive and have fun, and one female character is physically accosted and she's emotionally upset, and she's told to calm down and report. It's a very male, militaristic, very concrete, straightforward, just the facts, and she's expected in that moment to calm down and report. And if that was the attitude of the time, then it would have been kind of present in all the different episodes in one form or another. That's anyway. I'm going to stop talking about that part.
Given the times the episode was produced in, how might the portrayal or the enemy as a person of conscience, or at least not as a stereotypical villain / enemy, have affected the audience? How did it shape our own thoughts as we watched it for the first time? I think enemies who aren't entirely evil, I think those are the most effective. I think it's most effective as also when you're trying to draw an analogy to make them nuanced and balanced. And also at the time to sort of look at people on the other side of a conflict as fully rounded out human beings with their own, or, people with their own experiences in life stuff, humanizes the enemy and, tries to, I think the episode was partly effective because you could also see things from the commander's perspective. and sort of see his wheels turning as well as Kirk's.
Right.
Yeah, I believe it was intentionally meant to generate empathy, and I think it was pretty successful in that regard. You know, in terms of putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and not seeing things as so black and white, although most of us probably did see it as black and white if we watched it in the 60s or 70s. But I know, really bad pun.
This
But yeah,
episode was like really eye-opening to me. Sorry.
What's that, Dan? Sorry?
This episode is like really eye-opening to me for that theme, because like I saw it in my childhood, and basically like I was brought up by my mom, and with basically a concession, like one guy after the other, and the first guy was Nepalese and the second guy was black. And I was like, watched this episode, I was like, I didn't realize like people could actually like be so judgmental based on appearance. I was like, wow,
right,
at a young age. And so yeah, it really like opened my eyes to how some people can be so judgmental and yeah, such bigots. It was quite a shock.
We see a lot of examples in the modern world of current times of people trying to create villains, trying to create enemies, and the easiest way to create an enemy is to stereotype them, or to caricature them, or to create kind of qualities that are associated with them and then emphasize those qualities so that you dehumanize them. You take them away from someone that can be empathized with, right, to someone who is so alien that you don't recognize yourself within them. And then along comes the hate, and then along comes the violence. So if you can deconstruct that, if you can back that up and create the enemy, as Vanessa said, as you said, Vanessa, you can create an enemy that you can see yourself in, or that is humanized, then you can recognize yourself in their choices. And if they're portrayed as being thoughtful and being conscientious, all qualities that you can see within yourself, it's not so easy to hate. And that's what this episode, as Glenn, as you said, beautifully done, right? It really created this moment where it wasn't so easy to see who was right and who was wrong. That it was a little bit, I mean, it wasn't, of course, the Romulans did something wrong in the episode, but the commander himself, he wasn't the bad guy. He wasn't the villain. He was just following, orders, so to speak. And that in itself is a condemnation of his approach. But the idea that he could be humanized, I thought, for me, when I first watched it, and years later when I rewatched it, it was a very powerful moment.
Yeah.
Right, like at the conversation at the end where the commander says, if things were different, we could be friends.
Right.
Yeah.
And the way that he comes to that conclusion isn't, because they, had any sort of long drawn out conversation. It's because he's, watched Kirk's strategy and grew a respect for him out of that. And it's through the tit for tat battle that he sees what Kirk's character is comprised of, and draws from that a conclusion that this person is very like-minded and very cunning and much like me. This person is a mirror image of me, and we have a lot more in common than not.
And the fact that he had one final duty to perform, right? And that was he wouldn't allow his ship or his crew to fall into enemy hands. It was very, very, very reminiscent of kind of the story of the Cold War, and how, that was part of the game. So that in itself was also heroic. You could almost see a heroism in the self-sacrifice and the sacrifice of the crew and the loss of the ship. You could see that as the enemy being heroic, which humanizes them as well. But that was taken away a little bit in Quality of Mercy, the captain knew he had to pay the price for his choice, right? And he accepted it willingly. But the fact that it was his allies, his comrades, who ended up killing him, and destroying the ship, didn't that kind of completely it kind of took this humanization quality that they just spent the episode creating, right? And then they took it away when they put in the institution of the military itself, right? Because they were doing something that was inherently wrong. They sacrificed the man, the crew, some of which were just following orders for no reason than to prove they could, right? Which turned them back into villainous enemies again. Anyway, sorry, I rambled.
So all that being said, how many pips would you give this episode? For me, 5. It's a classic. It's a favorite. I can watch it over and over again and find something new each time.
Yeah. Balance of Terror is among my top 5 Star Treks of all time across all series. So it's definitely a 5. If I could give it a 5,000, I would, but we'll stick with 5.
I've really enjoyed this discussion and really I agree with you that it's a great episode. I'm sort of hesitant to give it a 5 because I'm hesitant to give anything a 5. But I was thinking I'd probably give it a 4. And while we've had this discussion, actually, I realized a bit of subtext that I never realized before. Because for years, I knew the Romulans were based on the Romans historically with centurions and stuff like that. But I never realized that as an analogy, as an historical analogy, religion could be seen as a factor in that, because the time of the Roman Empire, Christianity and various religions that were different from what's it called, Mithra, were coming into the Roman Empire and were seen as enemies of the Roman Empire and their belief systems and stuff like that. So yeah, I just realized you get a bit of that in the chapter.
Yeah, I'd give 5.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd give 5. It's classic.
Thanks to the panelists for joining this discussion. We hope you, our viewers, have enjoyed it as well. Let us know in the comments what you thought about this episode of Balance of Terror. And please remember to subscribe to the video, and we'll see you next time. Trek you later.
What we'll be discussing next week?
Discovery.